Hey, what's up, you guys? It's Brian here. I just wanted to make another video on elections. So I'm actually going to be doing like election reviews and like stuff that happened in the election, talking about stuff that happened in the elections, the candidates and stuff, and how I would have voted, ranking the candidates and all that. So yeah, so actually I'm going to go all the way back to 1960. I don't really know much about elections before. I know a little bit about them, but not much. Yeah, 1960. So I'm going to, talk about the candidates and what happened and stuff. So initially, Dwight Eisenhower was the president. He was in his 8th year. Yeah, he was 7th year, I guess, technically. Yeah, he was pretty popular. He wasn't like George Washington or anything, but he was pretty popular president. The economy was doing pretty well. The Republican side, there was really no competition. It was Richard Nixon, who was the current vice president at high approval rating, so he got that nomination very easily. It's not really worth talking about the other candidates right now. On the other side of the aisle was two different candidates. You had Hubert Humphrey, who at the time was a senator, and then you also had Lyndon B. Johnson, who was also a senator from Texas, and then you had another senator from Massachusetts, John Kennedy. All three did very well. It was a very close race, but at the end of the day, John Kennedy got the nomination. John Kennedy's father was the ambassador to England for a few years. Yeah, it was pretty cool. Yeah, John Kennedy, JFK, that he's called, was very inspiring. Him and Richard Nixon were pretty close in the polls. They're both pretty popular. At the end of the day, probably because of the debate, it was actually the very first televised debate they ever did in a general election, with general election candidates, televised debate ever. It really showed a lot. It meant a lot because people listening on the radio thought that Richard Nixon won the debate, but then people watching on TV thought JFK won the debate because he looked very clean. His hair was brushed very well, like mine. He was like very shaved, and Richard Nixon, you see his 5 o'clock shadow and stuff. It just was inspiring. Yeah, ended up being a close race. At the end of the day, John Kennedy ended up winning the election. I think the debates what inspired him to it. Had I have been voting in that time, had I been around and been old enough to vote and stuff, I would have voted for JFK. Most likely, not that I would have minded Richard Nixon, even though corruption would rank as the later. But yeah, I would have voted for JFK all the way. Because he actually ended up preventing World War III. So I'll make a video about that. Yeah. So the next election we're going to talk about is the election of 1964. The election of 1964 was a very interesting election because just 1 year prior, or a little bit before, President Kennedy, who had prevented World War III with the Cuban Missile Crisis, many say, the economy was doing well, he's a popular president, was unfortunately assassinated. Rest in peace, JFK. It was a lot of Americans were sad for a really long time. So initially, who the vice president was Lyndon Johnson, who had been the Senate Majority Leader, but then JFK chose him to be his running mate. Some say he was involved with it, but I'll make a video on that conspiracy theory sometime. But yeah, it was Lyndon B. Johnson. He got the nomination again easily. He defeated all his Democratic challengers. He ended up going up against Barry Goldwater. So initially, the big thing about JFK and Lyndon B. Johnson, and Hubert Humphrey too a little bit, they changed the trajectory of everything from like about race and stuff. Like for years, the Democratic Party was the party of, racism, segregation, all that, and like discrimination, and the Republicans were the ones that were like anti-racism, anti-discrimination, anti-segregation, stuff like that. Segregation, sorry. But JFK changed it. So did Lyndon Johnson. They passed the Civil Rights Act. They also passed the thing where anybody could sit on the bus, anybody, no matter what skin color, what race, whatever. They gave the right to vote, all that stuff. African American people, it was allowed in certain parts of the country, so it wasn't allowed in other parts. They allowed African American people to vote anywhere they wanted in the country. It was very inspiring, and I praise both them for doing that. They were actually able to work with Republicans in Congress. So Lyndon B. Johnson was very popular because of that. His party was kind of mad at him, but he was still very popular going into the election. So the Republicans nominated Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was very conservative, very much a Republican, but he tried running a pro-segregation campaign. Backfired on him. I mean, he only really won the Deep South. Lyndon Johnson destroyed in the election. He really won big. Yeah. And at the end of the day, I would have voted for Lyndon Johnson. Thought he was a pretty decent president economically, and he did the civil rights stuff, so I would have voted for Lyndon Johnson. Alright, on to the next election, the final election. We have two more elections we'll talk about in this video. I'll do four. The election of 1968. The election of 1968 involved President Johnson was originally running, but his approval ratings had gone down because of the Vietnam War. So, yeah, his approval ratings had gone down, so he ended up dropping out of the race. His vice president, Hubert Humphrey, ran, And Richard Nixon, of course, who was the vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, was the 1960 Republican nominee, chose to run again. He had a little bit of a tough primary. There were talks of Governor Ronald Reagan, who was the popular governor of California, running, a couple others, but he ended up getting the nomination. So it ended up being Hubert Humphrey versus Richard Nixon. George Wallace, the racist governor from the South, ran. Terrible person. He ran as an independent. He won the Deep South. Ultimately, Richard Nixon ended up winning. How I would have voted, I wouldn't have voted for any of them, actually. I probably would have written in Lyndon Johnson. Yeah, that was the election of 1968. Alright, guys, so that's it for this video. I'm going to make another election video tomorrow about 1972's election, 1976, and 1980's elections. Alright, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more, guys. Alright, bye. Have a nice night.